Hi. Unfortunately, I'm going to read this, but I hope I will sort of make it look as if I'm talking to you. One of the reasons is that normally I talk too much. So, I mean, I'm terrified at the idea of having to do only 15 minutes. So hopefully it would work. I timed it, so it should be okay. I was talking to myself yesterday for a whole day. I also hope that the jokes, I hope they would work here. So when I was invited to give a brief presentation of my work, my approach was that I should hold onto a very simple remit, keep it open. My understanding was that such a presentation should not actually be riddled with technical jargon, and that it should prompt some conversation. So I'm trying to avoid being abstract here. At first, you might think I'm complaining that my work is being dumbed down, but actually I tend to look at this from the opposite direction. In fact, I find this extremely challenging because I am put on the spot and I can't hide, even though I'm hiding behind the lectern here. Frankly, I feel worse than a naked model in a drawing studio. And as you know, I worked in both art schools and in education schools teaching arts education. So I mean, I'm quite familiar with the drawing studio. But at least there, models are professionals and they see themselves as clothed because they are nude and not naked. In the sense that generally few of us that take any exception, there are few of us actually who take any exception to the fact that models are not wearing any clothes, because they are in effect engaging in an activity which, by and large, is held sacred, beautiful, and often rather difficult to articulate. It's also very controversial, and obviously here I'm talking about what we call art. Now, in my case, I feel naked here, even though I have clothes, because even when I have a notion of what I'm doing, the rules are rather open-ended. And this is one of those self-inflicted things which we do if you're dealing with philosophy and the arts. Furthermore, in an open-ended conversation like this, one's thoughts tend to be very subjective, and some might argue that subjective arguments do not live up to the expected academic standards that a professorial presentation would warrant. But here I would beg to differ. In fact, I would be dishonest if I were to deny the subjective nature of my work. And this is because, first of all, what I do deals with things or matters that people might call subjective, though I would not be very keen on that word. But there's no way I can negate this. More to the point, rather than try to make this subject objective, I deal with it in more than one subjective manner, to the extent that I am not seeking any agreement, but rather I'm seeking dispute and contradiction. So if people ask you what is critical theory, that's my answer. We are troublemakers. And I encourage my students to be troublemakers, especially if they're teachers. So this means that you have to follow that we all interpret our world in different and contrasting ways, and that this is a very good thing. This also means that we are being very singular in our opinions, while perhaps we are all universal in our nakedness. Because throughout our entire life, we are never sure how prepared we have to be, and somehow the only thing that we have for certain is that we have ourselves and nothing else to cover us. So I can assure you that I find nothing wrong with opinion, informed or otherwise, and more importantly, there's nothing wrong with disposition and even our prejudices, as long as these do not hurt anyone in particular. So here, by prejudice and disposition, I mean the ability and inclination to come with judgments already made before one even starts a conversation. So I wouldn't blame anyone if they come and say, no, I don't agree with you because my opinion is, and I don't take any umbrage to opinion because that's where we start from. The reason I'm looking at this positively is because we always start from there, and it helps no one if we try to hide our instincts and responses. So, and without our instincts and responses, okay, we can neither learn and less so unlearn. And I would say this is kind of, this is where we're getting at in this paper. So we can neither learn and less so unlearn what we know, what we feel, and what we mean. Because after all, this is what really makes us who we are. But before I go off at a tangent, here is a story that you may have already read in the quick abstract that I provided. So let's start from here again. So this happened in Glasgow. I was giving a long lecture, actually, or a seminar to artist teachers in UWS. And I once asked them, actually, I asked them, can we undo the Mona Lisa? And someone asked back, what would that look like? And to be honest, actually, I didn't know. And I replied, I don't really know, but I am convinced that works of art must go undone. It's an educational prerogative for art to teach us nothing and for us to unlearn everything. So here I'm trying to explain what I mean by this. I don't think I explained this fully, however, because obviously, as I said, it took 2 hours to discuss this. But to try to explain this, I will dwell on the title and take it from there. So just to remind you, the title is Within the Outwith, a word which I really like. Having worked in Scotland before I came here, so I like the word outwith, even though people could tell me what does that mean. Undoing art, unlearning education. Now this kind of title actually, it pairs 6 words. You have within and outwith, you have doing and undoing, and you have learning and unlearning. Now immediately this raises at least 3 questions. Where is this within and outwith? Do we locate it anywhere? What are we doing and undoing exactly? I mean, what are we talking about here? And how do we unlearn and unlearn? Now, curiously, what raises these questions may be different, but they also look similar because they come from the same place and are often urged by the same questions that keep coming to us time and time again. So let's start with within and outwith. This could be anywhere and nowhere, because what we mean by what is intrinsic and extrinsic could be physical, it could be conceptual, or a bit of both. So we can see ourselves as belonging to a community or a city or a village or a university and see how we are within or outwith such a city or community, whatever that is. We can take a bigger picture and look at how we remain within or outwith a world outlook, a concept, a religion, an ideology, or indeed a philosophy or way of life. We can be a bit more abstract and think whether anything has a within, an interiority, or whether what we are and do always lies outwith everything else, because the world is made of units, things, or individuals that behave according to how they work together as autonomous entities, events, or beings. I'm sure these are the philosophical questions that we all engage with. So with this business of an outwith or a within, you can take any context or level you want. Now, in terms of doing and undoing, I'm a bit more specific here. Here I'm speaking about art. As an academic, an arts practitioner, and a teacher, I'm engaged in 3 disciplines, as you've heard in the introduction. I deal with philosophy, I deal with art and education. The interesting bit for me is how they converge and how they don't. In other words, how they are intrinsic to each other, but at the same time, how they are also separate, distinct, and are found out with each other. But you may protest and say that now I'm becoming a bit too abstract and I am, getting away with academic banter. So to make sure we are on the same page on this, I see a context to this relationship in education, the stuff we do here. And at this stage, I am also quite interested in how learning and unlearning play a role in all of this. So when I say education, I don't mean just, primary and secondary schools or K-12 as they say in America, but actually we're talking about the whole thing, whether it's formalized or not. So this is because the whole issue of learning and unlearning come to play is because I happen to think, and you may well disagree with me, that the assumptions that we often make about art and education are presumed by a desire to be good, true, and beautiful, when in effect we never question what we actually mean by this, especially because we value education so much that we have destroyed it, because we have stopped ourselves from unlearning. Just checking that I'm getting the right thing here. Or perhaps better said, because we continue to forget that in effect what we learn is often best unlearned, so that we can move into an understanding of our nakedness, if you like, or our weakness, or whatever it is, which is often kept hidden and of which we are always ashamed. But before you start worrying that I'm a naturist here, because we keep talking about nakedness, I'm not going to take my clothes off, it's too cold. I want to say that this is what I also mean by undoing the Mona Lisa, or any other work of art of your choice, so you can pick and choose. Art allows me to say things that other subjects don't. I mean, this is the benefit of being an interdisciplinary person. I mean, art allows me to say things which perhaps in other disciplines you can't say that. As a discipline, education, for example, in contrast with art, is very dominated by measure and evidence, which is often used as a political ploy to reinforce systems of learning that have nothing to do with education, but are more close to instruction and social engineering. If you think about the debates on education, even on the rare occasion that the arts are mentioned, it is always a very functional and dry discussion, where even when some speak of the child as a whole person, this is ultimately linked to a political understanding of a fully fledged, realized individual that would fulfill social needs and will be happy, however, as a member of a preordained system. So like education and indeed like democracy, art is often relegated to a functional role. We are told that it is good for us, that it is very important because we can learn from it. And these days we are also told that because it is creative, it is useful and functionally correct. When art is not seen as fulfilling these criteria, we get into trouble. So we censor it, we close it down, we denounce it as antisocial, as bad, as ugly, and as untrue. But then again, we use art's perceived madness by regarding the artist as a mad person of genius whose work will ultimately do us good if only we can domesticate it. So ultimately, we just sort of turn around art and make it useful. So the emphasis on art is always a formative one. It is educational and it is expected to give results for the greater good. This sounds benign enough until we realize that this is the good of the great and the powerful. And this is where we go badly wrong. Art becomes an instrument and another functional aspect of the so-called common good. It is allowed to be rude, crazy, and scandalous because it is already framed within the reinforcement of a societal assumption where democracy is not for us, but we are for democracy. This is where learning comes back to haunt us, and we go back into the same cycle by thinking that we can readjust the state of affairs by learning other things. But before you think I'm doing the same and presenting you with unlearning as a phase of undoing what we have done in order to do something again, I suggest that you stop hoping for a comfortable end to the story. To undo the Mona Lisa does not amount to do or make something else, but to try to understand art, and indeed education, from a radically different perspective. The big challenge lies in how to break the cycle and how to shift this prevalent paradigm which continues to construct orders that have already been bankrupt for a few decades. Here I have in mind the model of art as a form of learning and of learning as a form of art. Rather than start from a point of agreed assumption or reject it, I want us to imagine, rather than think, how education can happen beyond the assumption of actively producing or passively receiving a destination that has already been reached or prepared for us. The big question is almost similar to Christopher Columbus's. What's on the other side of the sea? He thought he would reach India, yet we know that he bumped into something that wasn't meant to be there, what was eventually called America, conveniently named after a political protege and appointee, Amerigo Vespucci, whom the establishment did not consider to be as mad as Columbus. So, the question that art puts to education is, how can we think of something that may or may not be there? How could we even more move away from thinking that we can find something? Why can't we just take off without any expectations? So I will give two examples. I hope I have time. The first comes from religious belief and how difficult it is for many believers and atheists alike to unlearn the simplistic notion of God as a man up in the sky and the fatalistic assumptions that ensue. It is interesting how in the several arguments that arise between atheists and believers, it becomes clear that we learn both lines of thinking in pretty much the same way. The trouble is actually with learning of belief, where there is no real place for unlearning and where we seem to be reassured that the building blocks of learning, found in all aspects of education, be it scientific, artistic, religious, or whatever, are assumed as necessary even when we say the contrary and believe in the education of the whole person with all the responsibility and freedom that it entails. The second example comes from art, where I am always frustrated by the endless and rather futile debates between skills and creativity. Should we have skills first and be creative later, or should we do the other way around? Which comes first? So, in such debates, no side is inclined to question the very core of the argument, which to my mind is simply flawed, that of learning art. Now, this is compounded by the false question, can art be taught? Someone actually eminent wrote a book about this. To which I could probably say yes, while adding, because art must not be learned. Now, far from a provocative question, this is a question that prompts the argument and distinction between learning and education. Just as we cannot assume unlearning as a reversal of learning, which, as we can see from the God versus atheism debate, is in and of itself a false argument, the argument of a non-taught art is a misrepresentation of the very notion of unlearning, a concept that comes directly from art speak and which is often misused by artists themselves and educators. Now, what I'm basically saying is that unlearning is not a reversal of learning, but something more akin to a breaking of the cycle of knowing and discovering, which Columbus had to confront when he realized that he found a land that he was never looking for. If you think about it, he was expecting to find a civilization there, and then what he found was something which he didn't consider as being civilized. And he said, what am I going to do with these savages? So he decided to plunder the whole place. And then, his allies came in and did the worst. So this alters the whole assumption of education, and more so, it disallows the artificial distinctions that are drawn between a top-down banking didactic system of instruction and a presumed student-centered constructivist form of learning. Both remain trapped by learning, which is a simplistic way of assuming the events of which we live and engage in the world. So in conclusion, I must add that many would regard what I just said as pure nonsense. I have been regarded with some suspicion by colleagues who are fond of methodologies and who would dissuade students from this kind of thinking and from finding without necessarily assuming that they are what they are looking for. Because sometimes I tell students, just, find, don't look for. In my reply to such objections, I can tell you that artists, and I'm also told even more experimental scientists, often work in this way. I never sketch or plan what I am going to paint. Likewise, in my academic work, I often encourage my students to find rather than search. This was said by Picasso, by the way, not me, without necessarily knowing what they want to find in the first place. To do this takes a lot of undoing and unlearning, and I hope I began to show how strange my business of bringing art, education, and philosophy together tends to be. So, do wish me luck. I thank you for your patience.